Well, thank you all for being here. My name is Steve Robinson. I'm a partner at Allen, Boone, Humphries, Robinson. We are a law firm based in Houston with offices in Austin and here in Dallas. We were formerly Vinson & Elkins lawyers. We left about 21 years ago. Small beginning. We're now, I think, 44 lawyers, total staff of about 165. And we really do one thing and one thing only. And that is we work with land developers and governmental entities throughout Texas to provide public infrastructure, which ultimately is really about making the math work for land development projects. We are a little bit unique in the sense that we have a very active political and legislative practice. It kind of comes with this turf. Most of the laws that we deal with, going back to our days at Vinson & Elkins through today, we carry those laws, we draft them. Most of the regulatory structure in which we are involved with are regulations that we work on. The overall objective of most of our projects generally begins with someone coming in with a land plan and having a project that the math simply doesn't work because of the cost of the infrastructure needed to develop the project. And so there are a variety of tools available under Texas law that permit us to finance public infrastructure, and we'll be talking about those today. Just a little nomenclature. I will use the word MUD. I also may use the term special district interchangeably. There are a variety of these tools that are very similar. What we're talking about is a political subdivision, meaning a governmental entity, with a defined set of boundaries that levies, in most cases, a property tax to finance infrastructure. They are creatures of limited jurisdiction, meaning they are like a city, except for if a city only had the right to do water, sewer, drainage, and roads, meaning build those and finance those projects and then operate them. In some counties, we can also do parks and recreational facilities. And the reason we cannot do those here in North Texas, I manage our North Texas office because the North Texas delegation, when we drafted the constitutional amendment that permitted these districts to expand their powers to do parks and recreational facilities, the North Texas delegation was not in favor of having parks and recreation facilities being done by these districts, and so we cannot do them here. We can do them in Houston, in Austin, and in San Antonio, and then most recently there was a constitutional amendment last go-round that allowed El Paso to do parks and recreational facilities. These are basically a way to provide municipal services or municipal infrastructure where they don't exist, meaning you have undeveloped land or you have land that is even an infill project where you don't have a city willing to expend the dollars to build out the infrastructure needed to allow the land development to occur. You'll also, here in North Texas, you'll often hear freshwater supply district, water control and improvement district, a number of other names. For all intents and purposes, there was a time where there was a lot of distinctions between those. Today, there really are largely no meaningful distinctions. We'll talk about some, but they're basically governmental entity, limited jurisdiction, building water, sewer, drainage, roads, and in some counties, parks, utilizing a property tax to finance those facilities. Talk a little bit about just general background. This is nothing new in Texas. And if you go back to the turn of the early 1900s, the first use of special districts, and Texas has always been, their view was, we want decentralized control, where we want things to be done at the local level to the greatest extent possible. And so we have lots of other types of special districts, meaning hospital districts, levy districts, all kinds of different to address certain different circumstances. But the earliest ones in the use of these were irrigation districts down in the Rio Grande Valley. A bunch of farmers get together. They need water out of the Rio Grande River. They need a set of canals. They may cover 20,000 acres, but nobody can build the canal on their own. So we're going to all create an irrigation district over all of our property. We're going to tax ourselves on a property tax basis and share the cost and finance that those facilities. Fast forward, really following World War II, and as Houston began developing rapidly, the city of Houston simply could not keep up with the growth. And let's just be honest, cities are very inefficient in their ability to deliver public infrastructure. And you will find this if you're going to stay in real estate. When you're ready to develop and you're waiting on the line because it's 2 miles away, and the city says, well, I've got it in my CIP and we'll have it there in 5 years. Well, that doesn't do much for you. Well, Houston was growing extraordinarily rapidly, and they had a problem. Geographically, Houston is very different than Dallas. Houston is really one big city with one huge extraterritorial jurisdiction or area of control, a few small cities around it. But basically, you're dealing with one jurisdiction for what has been 90+% of the growth in Houston over the last 50 years. And the leaders of Houston agreed with the development community, we can't keep up. We will allow you, through a public-private partnership that we call municipal utility districts, for you to go and make the decision about when to deploy capital. But the bargain is this. You've got to meet all of our standards. We've got to review all the plans. We've got to be able to annex where you build the utilities, where it'll become part of our system at a later date. And now we will let you decide when to pull the trigger and when to develop your property. You don't have to wait on the city of Houston in order to grow. And it led to fantastically efficient growth. In the North Texas MSA, we've got 212 cities, okay, in the DFW MSA. Most of them had their own water and sewer systems. Most of them wanted to control land use and tell you what lot sizes or what you're going to do. They didn't want anyone to be able to efficiently deliver without their control. And so the use of the districts here was much slower in developing than it was in Houston. Really, it was Houston, then Central Texas, and then most recently now here in North Texas. The other big difference in Houston and here in North Texas is the availability of groundwater. In much of Texas, if you want to develop a piece of property, you get a groundwater hydrology study, go dig a well, put in a little plant, and voila, you have water. You can build a little wastewater treatment plant, and you can develop your property. That doesn't exist here. There are some limited groundwater supplies, but by and large, everything's regionalized. The cities control all those regional systems, and so because of those regional systems, you had municipal control, and they were able to prevent the use of the districts and allow the developers to control the timing and when development would occur. That all began changing dramatically in the early 2010s, but really when we hit COVID and began with dramatically higher infrastructure costs, dramatically higher interest rates, dramatically higher land prices, all of the developers here in North Texas said, how is it that a lot in Houston is $75,000, $100,000 less expensive than here? And the answer was they're using these districts. And so I want to really explain to you in its most basic terms why we do this. If you don't remember anything about this presentation, remember this. If you don't have a district, you have one revenue event if you're a single-family developer. That one revenue event is when I sell a lot. And when I sell that lot, I need to get my land price, all my development costs, all my profit, all my marketing costs, but I also need to get all of my public infrastructure costs out of that lot sale because I only have one revenue event. If I have a district, I have two revenue events. I have a lot sale and I have a reimbursement or payment for all of my public infrastructure. To give you a little math, today our average per front foot cost is about $1,500. It's going up from there, but let's just use that for a 50-foot lot. $1,500 of public infrastructure per lot, $75,000 worth of public infrastructure. If I am Lennar Homes and I've got one community here that has a district and one community here that does not have a district, and the lot, 50-foot lot in a district sells for $75,000 and across the street it sells for $150,000, I am going to buy 100% of the $75,000 lots, okay? That is basically what we are doing. Now, why is that important to y'all? We are in the greatest housing crisis, and it is the biggest risk to the state of Texas at this point is the cost of housing. First-time home buyer age now is 38 on average. The affordability index, meaning a couple of median income in Texas, in North Texas today, in 2013, could afford 83% of the new housing stock. In 2013. Today, it's 27%, okay? If you're making the median income, we've gone from 83 to 27. And I've got kids in their late 20s. None of them own a house. My generation, and they have great jobs, every one of them would have owned a house. And so what we are doing with this system for land development activities is we are pulling out of the mortgage the cost of the public infrastructure. Now, I am not here to say that 100% of, in my example, of the $75,000 ends up in a reduction in the mortgage, because it actually ends up being different. I'll show an example here in a minute. What I am telling you is it may go to higher quality amenities that couldn't be paid for if you didn't have the district. It may go to less density because the city is demanding that you only have 60-foot lots and you know it only works with 40s and 50s. Well, if I have these reimbursements, I can have fewer lots, even though my revenue on the lot side won't be as much. I'll get my reimbursement revenue. And it may be, thirdly, in price reduction. This market, and for everyone in this room, if you're going to be in land development, you need to understand we have crossed the tipping point. There is not a single master plan community developer or large-scale developer that is not using one of these districts. That is completely different than 10 years ago in North Texas. It is a part of your future. If we recently had the master plan community event put on by BizNow, and 100% of the developers said, I will not do a large-scale development without a district. So when you're running a pro forma, if you're an analyst, you are going to have a line in your pro forma if it's a single-family residential deal or if it's a infill mixed-use, large-scale mixed-use deal for your reimbursements for infrastructure. That's why we do it. That's what this is all about. And I like to say it's only about whether or not you want to make money or not, because you cannot compete if you don't have. The guy who goes out there in Sanger and tries to build a large-scale master plan community without a district is destined to fail because they cannot economically compete. Okay? Today, all of our major development areas are actively using districts. We've got some distinctions between the markets, but in San Antonio, we created legislatively a district that we just use in that market that is kind of like a MUD on steroids, but it's a MUD with not only a property tax but also a sales tax and a hotel occupancy tax. But all of your major markets are utilizing these districts for their financing. It's interesting, in the early 80s, they had San Antonio MUD 1 that defaulted. And we'll talk a little bit about what protections we have in place because we don't have defaults anymore. It left a really bad taste in that market, in the mouths of that market, because they had a default. And we only had a few statewide in the big oil bus, but they were one of them. And so when the big PGA project came along, which is the project we do, where they play the golf tournament, the JW Marriott, Hill Country, that's in one of these districts. And we passed a piece of legislation specifically for that project. It was such a massive project, 1,000-room hotel, 1,000 acres of single-family development, 2 golf courses, all kind. So we were able to pass a specific piece of legislation for that project, and now everybody's just used it over and over again. Okay? Just some little market information. Last year, we sold $3.1 billion in bonds in this market for public facilities in MUDs. We've got over 2,100 active special districts in Texas, millions and millions of people. Think about Houston, 8 million MSA, 2.3 million city. You've got a few other cities, Sugar Land, Conroe, a few other cities. Where's everybody else live? They're all in the districts. 95% of all of the development in Houston is occurring in a district, and I'll submit to you in 5 years that will be the case here in North Texas. It's a big percentage today, probably 30 to 40%. In 5 years, it'll look very much like Houston. That's where all the growth is occurring. They're usually outside the city limits in the growth ring or in the city's ETJ, but you're going to see a lot more of these being done in city. Our firm uses these tools extensively in urban areas, meaning we do a lot of what we would call a business improvement district for supplemental services, doing public art and public plazas. If Clyde Warren was done today, it may be in one of these districts, like a municipal management district, as opposed to the way it was done. It just predated the use up here, but we use them extensively for maintenance and operations of urban centers, but also the redevelopment, putting in new streets, putting in new, water features and, streetscapes and all of those things. So we have a lot of those, and there's really kind of 2 models for that. One is kind of a build it and they will come, take a big area, put it in a district that everybody wants. The other are site-specific projects. So we do a lot of urban infill, but you're going to see a lot more even in our suburban cities here in North Texas. We'll talk about that later. And they work really well for master plan communities. I'll just tell you one really interesting fact. I had dinner with the number 3 guy, and he said, "Steve, you told me 25 years ago that the MUDs, are a way to mitigate risk of price increases." And he said, "I've got to tell you, 25 years later, we're 100% in agreement." He said, I visit 44 offices. And he said, between 2020 and 2023, we had about 100% run up in infrastructure costs. And the margins in every one of our divisions got crushed, with the exception of one. Those Texas locations with MUDs our margins stayed exactly the same. And why is that? They stayed exactly the same because we are financing the infrastructure on the basis of its actual cost at the time it is built, with a property tax to fund it. So unlike a PID, which you will hear, we'll talk more about, that is a fixed assessment, the people who did PIDs in 2018 on the basis of 2018 cost, that it created a fixed assessment at an interest rate that's now 300 or 400 basis points for their debt, lower pro forma, lower than it is today, are getting crushed because they're on a fixed basis with a PID. They can't keep up with those adjustments. So they're really good. If you're doing a large-scale master plan community, you can ride out 2 or 3 waves in the economy and not get hurt with those changes. So what do? We construct and operate water, sewer, and drainage, construct public roads, parks and recreational facilities in certain counties, as I mentioned. And it is in the Constitution, county by county. I can do Travis and Williamson. I can't do Lee and Milam that are just to the east. It is county by county, so you need to know where you are. All right. Other thing, if you don't remember anything else, this next box is super important. Our system is the only system in the U.S. that is purely a reimbursement system. California has Melrose districts, the metro districts in Colorado, CDDs in Florida. Those all are assessment-based vehicles. They're not property tax-based, and they are not reimbursement systems. In Texas, we started the use of these districts extensively in the 60s and in the 70s. We got into the 80s, and what happened? The worst bust. I mean, the difference in what happened in the Great Recession is nothing like what happened to Houston in the late 80s. I mean, the bumper sticker was, "Will the last person to leave Houston please turn off the lights?" I mean, it was that bad. And we had a number of defaults at that time in these districts, because at that time, before the bust, you could sell them on a raw land basis, meaning in advance of constructing the infrastructure. Well, the legislature said to us, either fix this system. We're Texans. We don't default on public debt, okay? And so you either fix it where they don't default, or we're going to get rid of it. So we actually, and our firm was there at the table, changed, and our regulatory entity that supervises is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. It was TRCC at that time, but we drafted a set of rules that made this a purely reimbursement system, meaning, first, developer takes development risk. You go out, you borrow the money, you build the infrastructure. 2, there are a set of financial feasibility rules that tell you when you can sell the debt, meaning you can sell the debt when you have created the taxable value that will support the debt service on bonds that we sell at a reasonable tax rate. And so that reimbursement-based system completely de-risks our debt because the developer has to perform. And the idea is governmental entities should not be in the land speculation business. They shouldn't be financing and taking development risk. That's for developers. That's why developers get compensated for taking risk. Now, what they ought to be given is absolute certainty about what the system is. And that's what we've delivered. What we have delivered is a highly regulated system that creates very inexpensive borrowing that has great certainty. So we have never had a time those rules went into effect in 1989, so we're up now to 35 years of utilizing those rules. This is an important point. We have a 0% default rate. There is no financing system in the country that is anything like that. 0% default rate since 1989. Not a single one. It's because it's a reimbursement system. But what more importantly is we are by far the lowest cost provider in the country of public debt for public infrastructure on a land-based financing system because the bond market knows that our debt doesn't default because it's a reimbursement system. So our interest rates, if you compare them to the CDDs down in Florida, maybe 300 basis points lower. Well, you sell $100 million of bonds, 300 basis points is a big difference. And who ends up paying that? The landowner, the homeowner. So we've created a system that is designed to be as efficient as possible for the homeowner or the business if it's a commercial district by having the lowest cost of fund. In 2011, in Florida, which is probably the most comparable county, state for the use of special districts, they have what's called a CDD, a Community Development District. They had 350 defaults on their debt following the Great Recession, and Texas had 0. We have proven that this system works, and for you in the development community, if that's where you guys end up, have the great benefit of knowing with certainty that if you utilize the district, you're going to borrow inexpensively. There is always going to be a market for the debt, and you're going to, if you meet your pro forma, we're going to give you your money back, on a reimbursement basis. It's a really important point. We also have the ability to do supplemental services, and a lot of times when we go out in the unincorporated areas, there's no fire department, no trash service, no police service, other than maybe the county sheriff. Our districts can, on a fee-for-services basis, provide those. Many of them do. Many of them do it by contract. We do have the ability, with adoption of a fire plan, to bond finance the fire station also. So we often see that being done. And obviously, we have all the powers to implement. Power to contract, to tax, eminent domain. We can't stop a drainage ditch at the end of our property if the outfall channel is half a mile away, so we can condemn right away to outfall operations. We can operate water plants, sewer plants, etc., charge fees. So why do we do it? New growth pays for itself, okay? If you build in a city a master plan or a large-scale community, there is a 100% chance that the existing taxpayers are subsidizing that project. It's an impossibility for it not to be, because you have to provide services equal to those services that are provided by the city. You have a few rooftops. You're in a massive, maybe 10-year subsidy from the existing taxpayers. When we put it in a district, when the district pays for everything on a standalone basis, the existing taxpayers are not being asked to subsidize that new growth. High-quality infrastructure. If you're not in a district and you're out in the county, you may build a community that has 1-inch lines and you can't put out a fire. You can't do that. With a district, you have to meet all the TCEQ rules along with any of your local regulatory requirements, so you don't end up with substandard infrastructure. Local control. These boards are initially appointed by the TCEQ or the legislature, but ultimately the residents in the district are going to run for the board, and they are going to be the governing body like a city council. Tax-exempt financing. This is an important part of our system. We're paying for public infrastructure. Congress has provided us a federal subsidy in the form of our bonds that we issue. The interest income that you receive on our bonds that we sell in this market are exempt from federal income tax. So if you bought a corporate bond for a $5,000 corporate bond with a 5% interest rate, you get $250, you're going to pay your income tax bracket on the $250. on a tax-exempt bond, $5,000 bond, 5% interest rate, you get the $250, you put $250 in your pocket, and you do not pay federal income tax on that. So on a interest rate adjusted basis, you're really getting 7.5 or something, something around there. But you're not paying federal income tax. That lowers the borrowing cost, makes more efficient. Congress wants public infrastructure to get built, and so this is a big part of the benefit of being in these districts. And as I mentioned earlier, more attainable housing. If I can pull that $75,000 I talked about earlier out of your mortgage, you make the mortgage more attainable for more people. And as I mentioned, that is our biggest crisis or problem in Texas today. You want to really know why we do this. If I have a MUD versus no MUD, and these are old numbers, and the difference between this number and this number, this is public infrastructure. I've got to sell the same lot for $100,000 that I can sell for $50,000 if I can pull all the infrastructure costs. Now today that number is much higher. But every national home builder is going to take their lot price and they're going to build a house somewhere between 18 and 22% of the lot price. It's a metric that is used nationwide everywhere you look. So more expensive lots, you're going to build more expensive houses. I'm not saying you couldn't build a less expensive house, but on a more expensive lot, every home builder is going to build a more expensive house. So if you take even at the low end at 18, you're going to build a much more expensive house on that lot. Then if you take all the costs, down payment, loan, this is difference between a conforming and jumbo at the time. But even if you take into account a very high MUD rate, which is only permitted down in the Houston area, $1.50 per 100 or 1.5%, go all the way down, you're going to end up with a person with either $2,300 monthly payment or $3,800. And the income to qualify goes from $100,000 to $165,000. You've priced a whole lot of people out of the market. If our problem is we need more $300,000 houses and $350,000 houses, then we need $650,000 houses. We need a way to pull the infrastructure cost out of those lot prices. We are very highly regulated. The MUDs have very limited powers, as I mentioned. The plans all have to be reviewed by all local governmental entities, whether it's in the ETJ. If you are in the ETJ, which is a ring around the city, where, understand, I'm not going to get into civics class, but you've got a ring around a city that's from 1 to 5 miles. No one in that ring has ever voted for anyone in the city that is regulating. So we've got regulation without representation. You can talk about whether that's right or not, but they can apply their subdivision ordinance and plan review in the ETJ. But they don't have the right in that area to require a building permit. They do not have zoning. They do not have lot size control. So they have some regulatory authority, but one of the things that they do have is they have the right to consent to whether or not you utilize a district if you are in the city or in the city's ETJ. When you go outside of the ETJ into the unincorporated county, you are subject to county regulations. Our counties are creatures of very limited jurisdiction. Some understand that, some do not. There's probably more and more litigation over that. But counties cannot do water and sewer systems. They cannot zone. They cannot control lot size. But they often attempt to indirectly with infrastructure devices. We're talking a lot about those things in the legislature. But there's very different regulatory controls depending whether you're in a city, ETJ, or in the unincorporated area. Unlike every broker that I deal with, my first question on any project is what jurisdiction am I in? Tell me, what is the regulatory scheme that I need to understand for this? Because it doesn't matter if it's the greatest piece of property in the world. If you're in the ETJ and the city is the only one with water and they regulate you and they said, well, we're not going to give you any water if you want to do 40-foot lots on your project, it doesn't matter if it's the greatest. It doesn't matter if 20,000 cars drive past it every morning. You're not going to develop it. So you need to understand what your jurisdiction is. Extraterritorial jurisdiction is a legislatively created ring of influence around a city's corporate limits where they have limited jurisdiction and they can consent to a district there. They can apply their subdivision ordinance. They can do plan review, and they can impose certain impact fees. Everything else that cities do, they cannot do in their ETJ, whether or not they act like they can or not, they can't. So building permits, zoning, lot sizes, all inspections. I want to come inspect, make sure you're meeting building code. No. In your ETJ, that is not within the scope of your control. And so that's the big difference between being in the corporate limits and being in the ETJ. But we've got to build all of our infrastructure to local. So if we're in the ETJ, we're going to have those water and sewer plants are going to have to be reviewed by the city, inspected by the city for infrastructure, not for the buildings. We're going to have to plat with the city. But in order for us to issue bonds in this market, we have to prove that we have met all of the applicable local standards. As I mentioned, we've got the TCEQ feasibility rules. The most basic rule is I'm going to have to, until my bonds are able to get an underlying credit rating, investment grade credit rating, or municipal bond insurance, I need to keep my debt to assessed value below 10%. Little math, I create a $1 billion project. I can sell $100 million in bonds because I kept my debt below 10%. And that means I can do that at a reasonable tax rate. Later in the game, when you have an underlying credit rating or municipal bond insurance, we can usually get up to around 13, maybe 14% leveraged in these districts. The bonds must be approved by the TCEQ, so we have an application process, and they have to go to the Attorney General. Really important thing, all of our bonds that are sold by our districts have to receive an opinion. They have a whole division of the Attorney General's office that all they do is go through every document going back to when we created the district, to holding elections, to authorizing bonds, to selling bonds, all the way through that whole process to prove that we complied with every state law to issue the debt, and then they'll issue their opinion. Important part of that is we don't have bond litigation in Texas because bonds are incontestable as a matter of law in Texas if you have received the approving opinion of the Attorney General of Texas, which is a beautiful thing. So it keeps everyone in this market they have to play by the rules because you have to get the Attorney General's approval. These are governmental entities, so we have subject to the Open Meetings Act, Public Information Act. All ethics laws of the state of Texas for governmental entities apply. Public bidding for all of our projects. Let's see, we can create two ways, through the legislature or through the TCEQ, through an administrative process. But remember, for us to create, we have to have received the city's consent if we're in a city or in the ETJ. What does that mean? Practically what that means is the city has bought themselves a seat at the table, and you're going to end up with a development agreement that's going to say this is what we're going to build. You're going to end up with the city's consent, and you're not going to get the district created before you have done that. Now, you may also end up with like a utility agreement as part of that. So limited circumstances, if you petition the city to create the district, they say no. Then you ask them to provide water and wastewater service, and they say no or just don't respond. Then you can go straight to the TCEQ and do what's crammed down. Now, this raises some really important recent legislative changes that our firm has really been the lead draftsman on. One is beginning in 2017 and then again in 2019, we passed a bill that removed the city's unilateral right of annexation. Huge deal. Applied in 2017 to big cities, applied in 2019 to all cities in Texas. So now if you develop in the unincorporated area or in the ETJ, the city will never be able to add it to the city without holding an election. Okay? So you go to the city and you say, look, this is the fork in the road. If you would like this to ever become a part of your city, then we need to work out an agreement, because part of that law that the part that we primarily drafted was called strategic partnership agreements. It's a long-term planning tool that basically you enter into the agreement with the city at the outset, build a project in the ETJ, and then it allows, once the project is developed, when the developer has been fully reimbursed for all the infrastructure, that the city can annex in pursuant to the agreement, not pursuant to an election. It is a huge carrot for the city, and it has been used over and over and over again to make deals. We're actually making more deals because of that change. I used to say that was the biggest change in municipal law in my 34-year career, but it's not. The biggest change is in 2023, where we passed a bill called Senate Bill 2038, which is called the ETJ opt-out bill. And so today I can go to the city and say, you want to make a deal? They say, no, we're not going to make a deal with you. And then you just submit a petition, and 45 days later, you are no longer part of the city. It is a massive consequences. And we actually are making way more deals today than before Senate Bill 2038, because the playing field has really been leveled between the municipalities and the land development community. And it really had to be, because of the massive restrictions, we're really, add to this attainability crisis that we've got. The county can review creations. There is a fourth way to create districts, I'm just mentioning because you sometimes see it up here in North Texas. You'll see a freshwater supply district. A county can create a freshwater supply district through Commissioner's Court for a tract, and it doesn't give you all the powers that you need, but you can then take that freshwater supply district, convert it to a water control and improvement district, and then you have the right to do water, sewer, drainage, and roads. And they often keep their name freshwater supply district. They're not. None of them are. They are all actually water control and improvement districts that have been converted after being created by Commissioner's Court. The MUD is governed by a 5-member board. They're just like your city council. They have limited authority. They're charged with developing the public facilities during the construction process. They hire a group of consultants to implement. They're the policymakers, the consultants implement. Because these are small, they generally don't have employees. There are a few very large ones that do, but by and large, they mostly don't. And it's an important point just from an interest, standpoint is, if you think about it, the way in which they implement the construction of public infrastructure is totally counter to the rest of the country's construction of infrastructure. Everywhere else, all the infrastructure is built by cities or counties with large pension funds and large legacy costs. You think about Houston with a city of 2.3 million And then the MSA is 8 million. Vast majority of those outside the MSA are in these MUDs in the municipal utility district, and they have built way more infrastructure than the city of Houston. And today they have exactly 0 pension liability, whereas the city of Houston has a ring around everybody's neck for billions and billions and billions of legacy liability that my children will be paying for and everybody else's children will be paying for. This is a pay-as-you-go system, which removes all of that legacy liability cost. The developer, if you are in that role, they request the creation, they drive the need. There is no obligation to go out and build. When you are ready to develop, you go build the infrastructure. You want to put another section on the ground. You want to expand a shopping center. It's your turn to make that decision about when. You partner with the board, because what you're doing is you're basically loaning the money to build the infrastructure to the district, and the district agrees to reimburse you pursuant to your development agreement. As I mentioned, the feasibility rules, you've got to be reimbursed once there's sufficient value is created. You've got to follow the rules to a T, meaning you've got to publicly bid, et cetera, in order. One thing I forgot to mention earlier, under the financial feasibility rules, we have differing tax rates that are authorized for financial feasibility throughout the state of Texas. In Houston market, because they have huge drainage costs, your max tax rate is $1.50 per $100 of assessed value, or 1.5% of the property tax value on the appraisal district tax roll. In Austin, Williamson, Travis County, and in 4 counties up here, Tarrant, Dallas, Collin, and Denton, those 4 counties have a $1.20 feasibility tax rate. All of the rest of the state is a $1, meaning 1% tax rate. So it has a little bit of impact, but I think that's designed to recognize some of the differences in infrastructure costs throughout the state. These are all your consultants: attorney, auditor, bookkeeper, engineer, financial advisor, tax assessor, collector, operator if you're going to operate water and sewer facilities. Your engineers kind of help you get the districts created, prepare creation reports and bond applications to the TCQ, and serve as your civil engineer for the developer. Districts typically levy 2 components of a tax: operation and maintenance tax and a debt service tax. Usually it's about 90-10 or 95-5. 95% of the tax rate is going to debt service, 5% is going to operations. If you look at the city of Dallas or any other entity, it's actually the opposite. Maybe 5% is going to debt service and the rest are going to all kinds of services and administration and et cetera. Because you as the developer want as many of those pennies of the tax rate paying for debt service, because that increases the amount of bonds that we can sell and speeds up your reimbursement. So maintenance and operations tax pays for your operations of the district, paying for your consultants, et cetera, maybe some repair and maintenance. And the debt service component amortizes the debt. And so if you were in Wise County and you had a $1 tax rate, you would probably have a 90 to 95 cent debt service tax rate and a 5 to 10 cent operation and maintenance tax. Over time, as you create value, generally those tax rates slowly float down. We sell unlimited tax bonds, and it's important to understand for our security for our debt, what we say is we're going to meet the financial feasibility test at that $1, $1.20, $1.50, but we're going to pledge to levy whatever tax is necessary to pay the debt. So in general, property values only go one way or stay flat, even in a recession. We've got lots of data to support that. But you could have a tornado or something that causes particularly if you have a big concentration of credit risk, if you had a big data center or something, In those events, the district will be obligated to levy whatever tax is necessary to pay the debt. That allows us to borrow at very low interest rates. So how does the developer get their money back? At the outset, we're going to enter into a reimbursement agreement that we will pay the developer back from bond proceeds once the taxable value is created. We're only paying back. It's not how much bonding capacity you have, it's how many projects you have. We issue bonds for projects. So you're issuing bonds, we build water lines, sewer lines, roads, and then we finance those facilities, and that's what we're able to repay. We are also able to pay the developer interest on their expenditures at the rate on the bonds. So it's not going to actually cover probably your borrowing costs. Our market right now is somewhere in the high fours, low fives for a non-rated, non-insured debt, mid to low fours for a AA insured bond. So that gives you an idea of what the interest rates are right now for our debt. We've got to have value on the ground. I talked to you about the 10-to-1 early on, and we've got to enter into that contract that obligates us to reimburse you at the outset of the district for the district to be obligated to repay you. Talked a little bit, a lot of these. The district decides they've created enough value. We submit an application to the TCEQ. We go through the TCEQ review. It's about a 180-day review. One note is our road bonds don't require TCEQ review, only water, sewer, drainage, and in those counties, parks. TCEQ said they deal with water and things like that. They don't know anything about roads, so they don't review road bond issues. Just the AG does. We have to meet the feasibility test. The TCEQ authorizes it. They actually physically come to the project and do an on-site inspection of all the facilities to make sure they're there and they've been constructed to standard. When we sell our debt, all the bond proceeds go right out the door, because what are we doing with it? It's not maybe late stage, we're building some facilities, but almost always what we're doing, selling the bonds, paying the expenses, and then the bulk of the money goes directly to the developer to pay them for all the projects they built. All right, a few other things. Municipal management districts, because you may see these, they're basically MUDs on steroid. We began using them mostly for in-city business improvement districts, but you are going to see them more in North Texas now because of one big difference. A municipal management district has a property tax, but it also has the ability to levy an assessment. And so if you remember, I told you our districts in North Texas don't have the ability to finance parks and recreational facilities with a property tax. But if I create a municipal management district that has all of the powers of a MUD, plus additional powers, and I have assessment powers, I can use the property tax to build all the water, sewer, drainage, and roads, and I can use the assessment to build all the parks and recreational facilities. So you're going to see more and more of these used up in North Texas. Lots of these are created legislatively, but we can create them through the TCEQ also. And you can see lots of things they often do. And so if you have the ability to utilize these, you may most likely use them to do the amenity side of your project. Tax increment reinvestment zones, you'll see a lot of these. That is not a separate governmental entity. It's just an area designated where the incremental increase in taxable revenue is used to finance. So let's just say you've got a tax base of $1 million, and you're going to go in and build a new project. That project right there, I mean, we do a lot of TERSs on projects exactly like that one, right outside the window. We're going to add $100 million. So you had $1 million of taxable value. Obviously, it's not to scale for the engineers in the room. You add $100 million. That $100 million is the captured appraised value. And then for a period of years, at a percentage participation, the city can contribute those dollars to pay for the public infrastructure. So, a little example, that $100 million, very common approach, for the next 30 years, the city is going to give 50% of that incremental increase, the $100 million of taxable value, their tax rate times the taxable value times 50%. They're going to contribute to build all the public infrastructure, replace all the sidewalks. They had to build a new water line to do it. They needed whatever public facilities they wanted to put in. One of the problems, and then obviously when year 30 is over, they get all of the value. And the idea is this: but for creating the TERS, that project would never happen, okay? That's the TERS concept. The problem that we've got right now with TERS is we're in a period of tax rate compression. The legislature has been really working to push down property tax rates, and every city and county's tax rates are going down a penny, 2 pennies. And so 5 years ago, if I had a 50-cent TERS, I could pretty much say, well, it's going to maybe 49, maybe 51. It's going to stay right in this range. Well, today that's not true. They're going down, down, down. So what have we done? What we are doing today, in order to make sure that you can still run your pro forma, because if I have a 50-cent TERS that's going to reimburse $100 million, and today it's 45-cent TERS, and I just lost 10%, so I'm only going to get $90 million today when my pro forma said $100 million. It's a real bad day. So how do we fix that? What we do is we layer a district over the top of it, municipal management district or a MUD. And so if the city's tax rate goes down, I can keep the overall tax burden exactly where it was, slightly increase the district tax rate, and make sure the pro forma remains in place. Often we're just putting a very small district tax rate. What does that do? It credit enhances those TERS revenues by having an ad valorem tax back behind it. So you will see a lot of those up here in North Texas. All right, public improvement districts, you will hear and see a lot about this. To be clear, I am not anti-PID. I just think they ought to be used where they ought to be used. PIDs are not a separate governmental entity. They are the city. They're just an area where a zone has been designated, the boundaries, where we're going to levy an assessment. To think about what an assessment is as opposed to a tax, an assessment is a benefit-based tool, meaning the benefit received by each person in that area must be equal to or greater than the amount of the assessment. So, simplest terms, I live on a block. These are where assessments started. I live in a block. We need to replace the sidewalk because it's all broken apart. The city says, we'll come in and build it, but the $100,000 sidewalk, you got 10 lots. Each of you need to pay $10,000, and we'll let you pay it over 10 years, or you can pay it off all at one time. So we're going to assess you for that benefit, and the city imposes that. Well, those work great on very small, defined projects. And I'm going to say very small. I mean, if you're doing a 100-acre, 150-acre project. Where they don't work well are very large-scale projects for a number of reasons. The first is the PID is not able to finance as efficiently as a MUD. If you think about our property taxes, if you are at July 1st, your penalties and interest for non-payment of taxes, I think, is now at about 37%. Okay? If you're going to pay one bill, if you're a property owner, pay your property taxes, because the penalties and interest are brutal under Texas law. And oh, by the way, we have an expedited procedure to take your property if you don't pay them. So in our municipal utility districts and management districts, we rarely see less than about a 99% collection rate, which obviously helps our ability to sell debt. People pay property taxes. Assessments are a lien-based system. I'm going to put a lien on your property, and then we're going to go and put out the assessment, and then we're going to lien your property, and we'll use the lien system to collect it. Well, what does that result in? You're going to pay your projected reimbursements are going to be significantly higher in a MUD than in a PID. Why is that? When we sell PID debt, which we do, we have to have a reserve fund, and we have to have coverage ratios. Why? Because what if we aren't able to collect the PID assessments? Okay? They're sold often on the front end before there's value on the ground. So we will take max annual debt service and put it in a reserve fund for 25 years. So you rarely see a PID above the low 70% on net proceeds to a developer. Our MUDs are usually in the 85 to 90%, so dramatically more efficient financings. You're also paying higher interest rates on which means you're getting fewer bonds from the PID. I mentioned project flexibility. When I set that assessment, I've set it and it's permanent. Yes, I can go back and say, Mother, may I, to the city to adjust it on the next section. But once you've collected it from somebody, you're not going to change it, irrespective of what have happened to your cost. So in a large-scale project, you can't possibly have a PID with a single assessment because costs are going to change throughout the entire life. You're not going to be able to keep up with inflation. The financing risk, MUD is separate governmental entity. You have very low risk there. City has to issue the bonds in a PID. We have already had a city in Texas have a political change, new city council members, and had a PID that they decided, no, we will not sell any more bonds. And that's a really bad day when you thought you were going to get $5 million that year in PID reimbursements, and they send you a check for $450,000 in assessments. You are toast. And so that political risk, you can't pro forma political risk. And then obviously from a maintenance standpoint, a PID is not a separate governmental entity. So in the discussions that we just had about maintaining parks, if I'm building a project and I want those maintained, I'm out in the county and I give them to the county. Most of these rural counties have never had a parks department in their history. They're not going to maintain all these parks, but they have to be publicly owned for us to finance them. The districts are a separate governmental entity. They can own facilities. They can maintain them. And so it's a much better way. And the last, just from the cities, what city really wants to enforce for a developer a lien and foreclose on people's houses because they didn't pay their PID assessment? None. Zero. So, does the city really want to be responsible for that? So now if you got a small project, the PIDs can work just fine. One last thing, we do have a grant program in Texas. Chapter 380 is for cities. Chapter 381 are for counties. And this is a city, for economic development purposes, can grant private companies money for any purpose that achieves their economic development goals. Typical deal, you come in, you're going to build a Target shopping center. We'll give you a grant of 50% of the sales taxes for the first 5 years that Target's open. And it's a 2 or 3 page agreement. You got to create a certain number of jobs. You got to build a certain amount of square footage, and then we'll give you back your sales taxes, for a period of years. One thing to note, unlike like the TERS and the management district and the MUD where we can issue bonds, we cannot securitize debt with a 380 or a 381 grant. Okay? With that, I'll stop there. I know that's a whole lot to throw at you. Happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.